Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We've got a critical mass of people who have joined. So good afternoon or good morning, everybody, and happy Valentine's Day. I'm DJ Nordquist, Executive Vice President at the Economic Innovation Group. What could be more romantic than talking about business formation statistics on the day of love? Virtual candy hearts to everybody who tuned in. So today is like speed dating for econ nerds. For approximately 20 minutes, we'll hear from our panel of experts and then go into Q&A. You can submit questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen anytime, and we'll address them as time permits. This webinar is being recorded and a full recap will be posted and shared with all registrants after we conclude today. So I'm going to briefly introduce our distinguished guests. Dr. Steve Davis is a distinguished professor of international business and economics at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. He's also affiliated with the Hoover Institution and BER in the Atlanta Fed and advises the Congressional Budget Office. John Haltiwanger is a distinguished professor of economics at the University of Maryland, College Park. He's also affiliated with NBER, the US Census Bureau, the Society for Labor Economics, and the Econometric Society. And last but not least, Jessica Looze is Director of Knowledge Creation and Research in Entrepreneurship for the Kauffman Foundation, where she leads a team conducting research that is responsive to the needs and challenges of entrepreneurs and is actionable for both practitioners and policymakers. So I'm going to do a quick scene setter. The last decade was the lost decade of entrepreneurship, but something good came out of the pandemic. 2021 was a record year for business formation with 5.4 million applications filed according to the Census Bureau. That's a 53% increase from pre-pandemic in 2019. We also saw a record year for high propensity or likely employer applications, which made up about 1/3 of all filings last year. So really, why should we care about these statistics? These potential startups represent the businesses most likely to lead to lasting job growth and innovation and ultimately prosperity. The new business surge that took off starting in the summer of 2020 is indeed broad-based, and total business applications last year were up universally across all major industry sectors relative to pre-pandemic levels. Similarly, every state, except Alaska, reported more applications last year than in 2019, up by an average of 48% over pre-pandemic annual totals. So this morning, the 2022 January numbers came out from the Census Bureau, and we had 430,000 applications for the month overall, with about 1/3 of those by likely employers, or about 140,000. So those numbers were down year over year from January 2021 by about 11% and 12% respectively, but that was higher than December 2021 by about 3%, and everything was significantly higher than pre-pandemic. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask Steve, so how does this compare to the Great Recession, and what's really different this time around? Is there any explanation of the underlying reasons for the surging interest in starting a new business? Basically, was the pandemic shock an outlier, a different type of disruption, or was it the right ingredients, the right time, the right situation?
Thanks, DJ. It's great to join you and John and Jessica to talk about some happy economic consequences of the pandemic. So in terms of your question, how does our pandemic experience compare to the Great Recession and its aftermath? There are three really big differences that feed into the entrepreneurship business creation numbers. First, the COVID-19 pandemic was a major reallocation shock to the economy. It accelerated what was already underway dramatically, the big shift from bricks and mortar retail to online shopping. Also brought a shift from sit-down dining to takeout meal delivery. It led to vigorous experimentation with remote delivery of professional, healthcare, and other services. So this kind of demand shift created new business opportunities. There was also an important spatial component. Workers and business people now spend a lot more time working from home. Business people spend a lot less time traveling. That means they're spending their dollars associated with work activity in different locations, creating opportunities for new business formations in the locations that benefit from that kind of shift. Now, a well-functioning economy responds to a reallocation shock with new firms, new commercial facilities, new goods and services, and even new business models. And that's what we've seen. So that's the first factor, just the shock, the nature of the shock itself In that sense, the pandemic recession was rather unusual compared to a run-of-the-mill recession. Second, household balance sheets are in much, much better shape now than after the Great Recession. Instead of a housing market bust, we've had a boom. Instead of a stock market crash, the market rose to new heights. And various government pandemic relief programs funneled enormous, really unprecedented volumes of cash to households and to businesses. And all of this left households, including both actual and prospective entrepreneurs, with the resources and willingness to start new businesses. Now, in this regard, I want to just put in a plug for some work that I've done with John Haltiwanger that over recent decades looks at the role of housing market booms and bust in entrepreneurial activity, formation of new businesses, and the growth of young businesses. And there we find powerful evidence that housing market booms and busts are indeed a big force. So that's a huge shift from the situation that prevailed after the Great Recession. The third force is subtler. On average, business formation and development costs fell in reaction to the pandemics. You might be scratching your head and saying, well, how so? So let me explain. So online businesses face lighter regulatory costs and restrictions than brick and mortar businesses, partly because they run afoul of fewer zoning and permitting requirements, and partly because they can more easily gravitate to business-friendly jurisdictions, okay? So as the overall demand for goods and services shifted to kind of online sources and delivery away from traditional brick and mortar, the average cost of starting a business across the whole economy fell, simply because there's more business formation activity in the kinds of businesses that are easier to start. Now, one other thing I'll mention in this regard, the pandemic triggered another trend that was already underway, which was advances in online communication platforms like the one we're using now, and further stimulated the platforms for recruiting remote workers. So both of those things also make it easier to start new businesses, especially online-oriented businesses, and especially in out-of-the-way places. So it's less important now to be in the thick of kind of concentrated urban areas to start a business than it was, say, coming out of the Great Recession. So I know we're on a short schedule. I'll stop there. That was already a long response.
That's okay. Just real quick. I know everybody's sort of hoping that we've left the lost decade of entrepreneurship behind us. Can you just talk generally about the broader economic benefits to having more startups and new business ventures?
Sure, there are lots of them, and I'll just touch on them briefly. First, you go back to my point about the reallocation shock. A flexible, adaptable economy has the capacity to adjust to shifts in demand, shifts in technology, shifts in working patterns. That kind of capacity is a form of human and organizational capital that gets built up with people's experience in starting, growing, developing businesses. If you don't have much of that experience, the economy's not likely to be well positioned to respond to reallocation shocks in the future. So the fact that we've done a lot of this activity now bodes well for our ability to adapt to shocks in the future. Second, we all know that amidst these millions of new businesses, there might be 2 or 3 firms that we look back and say, hey, that was the next Google, that was the next Microsoft, next Apple, and so on. Those firms are very few in number, but they ultimately have enormous impact on the economy in terms of employment, income generation, and innovation. Okay, so we don't want to lose sight of that. Whether we get 3 instead of 2, hard to know, but I think it's important to keep in mind. And then the last thing I'd say in this regard is young businesses in particular are employment intensive. They're intensive in their use of less educated and younger workers. So in terms of giving people employment opportunities, I'm not talking now about the Microsofts and Googles. I'm talking about the run-of-the-mill, everyday businesses. They are important sources of employment and income for millions of people in the economy, and they're often important to the local communities in which they operate.
Great. All right. So now I'm going to turn to John. So John, what do historical trends in actual business formation tell us about, what to expect from the current surge? We know that, a minority of the applications become employer businesses, about 15 to 25%. So do we think the pandemic might increase those numbers, or maybe even fewer firms will be jobs generators? Is that important? What does your crystal ball say?
So those are the big open questions. Let me talk a little bit about the historical evidence. Historically, there really is a very tight relationship between new business applications, especially these high propensity applications, and actual employer startups. But as you note, even for the high propensity, only a relatively small fraction, certainly less than 50%, make it as an actual new business. We're actually studying, we're trying to figure out what are the factors that lead some of these applications to become new businesses and others not? I think that's an open, interesting question, which we're actually working on. But back again to the historical evidence, while only a fraction make it, the connection's still very tight. And what do I mean by that? Essentially the elasticity of actual business startups with respect to new business applications, high propensity one, is actually close to 1, which is actually kind of remarkable. So as we talked about before, as you talked about in your opening remarks, for high propensity applications, we're over 30% higher in 2021 than we were in 2019. And so this elasticity one says we should anticipate 30% more actual business startups. Now, in thinking about that, it's important to recognize that this interestingly, this takes time. So one feature of the business formation statistics that doesn't always get paid attention to is actually it actually has a very nice series which actually shows the actual startups from the applications themselves all the way up through as far as it can go. And then currently that's up to 2017, and then projects those what's expected from those startups actually through January 2022. And that's where I was able to generate this elasticity number. The interesting thing is if we actually kind of look at the lag between the time of application and the startups, most of the startups occur within the first 4 quarters, but there's actually another 20% or so within 8 quarters. So that lag itself is interesting. So back again to your core question, do we know what's happening to the propensity as well as the lag? The answer is we don't know yet. And you might ask, well, how can we not know? But it turns out the gold standard data for being able to evaluate what's actually going on with startups is data that Steve and I have used in a variety of projects. Is out of a product called the Business Dynamics Statistics for Census Bureau. It's incredibly high quality data, but it's with a considerable lag. So currently, we actually only know truly about actual startups through to 2019. Now, the question is, do we know nothing? And the answer is no. Actually, I think we have some early signals that startups are surging. And I think probably the best one is actually an interesting series out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, out of the Business Employment Dynamics series. They have a series called Establishment Openings. And it's kind of a hodgepodge of actual new startups, but also new establishments of existing businesses. That's kind of interesting itself, right? If indeed we're seeing a surge in Walmart opening up new stores or other existing businesses and or reopenings. That series is now available through the 2nd quarter of 2021. That series has been surging in the first 2 quarters of 2021. So I would say we don't really know the answer to your question, but I think the early signs are we are going to see a substantial surge in startups. And then coming back to what Steve said, I think there's good reasons that we think the surge in startups makes sense.
Great. And then can you tell us from the data that isn't lagging, what kinds of businesses have seen the most growth and applications? And then are there like certain parts of the country that are seeing, jumps more than others? I know the Deep South is an interesting outlier.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that the surge in startups on the industry basis very much fits Steve's characterization of the kind of opportunities that have arisen for increased remote relationships between businesses and consumers and businesses and workers. And so 3 sectors and particularly when you look at the more detailed industry data from the BFS that have just skyrocketed, include non-store retailers, which fits into Steve's characterization, professional, scientific, and technical services, and that's actually partly where some of these remote systems and so on are literally being developed, but it's also where individuals who have those skills may be going off on their own, is the point, that they actually see opportunities to do that. A third interesting sector that's really taken off, particularly in 2021, is trucking and warehousing, and it's not so surprising, both given the supply side constraints, but supply chain constraints, excuse me, but also just generally the changing nature of the relationship between a business and consumers. It's what you said at the beginning is right. There's sort of been a widespread surge. It's still very concentrated. If you use the 3-digit data, there's about 100 or so 3-digit industries. 10 of them account for about 2/3 of the increase. And then the other thing I think that's important to remember is, on the one hand, I think it's right we're focusing our attention on the new employer startups. That's where the job creation, the innovation, the productivity growth is going to come from. But self-employment, and particularly non-employer self-employment, is an important form of economic activity. It's an important occupational choice and an important source of economic activity. We've also seen the BFS has another category of applications which are likely new non-employers. That's surged even more than the surge in likely employers. I think, and by the way, again, in industries that very much fit Steve's characterization, that we're changing the way that we consume and that we change the way that we work. So I think an important aspect of this, particularly on the non-employer side, is I think there's increased both incentives and opportunities for individuals to go out on their own, and they're doing it.
Great. All right. Let's talk. Let's bring in Jessica. So Jessica, can you discuss Kauffman's early stage, entrepreneurship research, and also, the difference between what you all call opportunity entrepreneurs and necessity entrepreneurs?
Sure. So in 2020, as the first year of the pandemic, we saw the highest rate of new entrepreneurs that we've seen in the 25 years for which we have data. An average of 3.8 out of every 1,000 adults in the US became a new entrepreneur in a given month in 2020. And this was up from 3.1 in 2019. At the same time, we saw a sharp decline in the opportunity share of new entrepreneurs, meaning that a larger proportion of individuals were starting businesses coming out of unemployment. And this is not entirely surprising, given the sharp and sudden rise in unemployment that we saw during the first year of the pandemic. But what is striking is just how far the opportunity share dropped, by 17.1 percentage points between 2019 and 2020. And for some context, in the midst of the Great Recession from 2008 to 2009, the opportunity share dropped by just 6.9 percentage points. So nothing like we saw in 2020. We're just now getting a glimpse at what these trends look like in 2021 as the data are becoming available, and the Kauffman Foundation will be releasing a new report on the early stage entrepreneurship indicators in the coming weeks. So I would encourage you all to check that out. But thinking about what this means for new entrepreneurs and really building upon what John was just sharing, historically, we know that opportunity entrepreneurship is associated with more growth-oriented businesses. So for me, this raises a lot of questions about what job creation is going to look like for these businesses that are starting during the pandemic. It's one of the things that I will be watching in the coming months and coming years.
Great. So I know you've done some research on, moms who are entrepreneurs, or we'll call them momtrepreneurs, if we can pronounce it. And I know that like the conventional wisdom, initially at the start of the pandemic was that mothers were dropping out of the workforce because the kids were home and they had no childcare. But then former CEA chairman Jason Furman found the opposite. And so are moms just sort of setting up shop in their homes and multitasking? What do you think is going on?
Yeah, so Furman and his co-authors find that women with young children make up a relatively small proportion of the overall decline that we saw in employment during the pandemic. And this makes sense, as mothers of young children make up a relatively small proportion of the workforce to begin with. Misty Hagenes at the Census Bureau has done some extensive research on women's employment during the pandemic, and she argues that the issue isn't so much that mothers are dropping out of the labor market entirely. Instead, she points to data that shows that many mothers are leaving active employment and taking leave or moving into unemployment. And she points out also, as a mother of 2 school-age children myself, I can certainly relate to that many mothers are continuing to work throughout the pandemic. They're just tired and stressed out and continuing to take on a lot of additional childcare responsibilities. Taken together, I think the research on what mothers are experiencing throughout this pandemic makes it really clear the continued need that we have in this country for affordable, accessible, high quality childcare. And this is true whether we're talking about entrepreneurs or we're talking about wage and salary workers. When mothers aren't able to stay active in their jobs, they lose out on opportunities to gain experience and to develop skills and to build connections that are crucial for success, both for employees and for entrepreneurs.
Great. And then lastly, what do you think the trends mean for policymakers? You hit on a little bit with childcare, but maybe you can expand on that.
Yeah. So for policymakers, in terms of trends and what they mean and things to focus on, we really need to be ensuring that we have equitable access to entrepreneurship. At the Kauffman Foundation, we think a lot about what it takes to build an economy that works for all people and also makes entrepreneurship an integral component of economic development. And a big part of this is ensuring that there's equitable access to things like financial capital and support structures, and also infrastructure, things like childcare that entrepreneurs need to be successful. All of these things, we're going to need to be really responsive to the many changes that we've seen throughout the pandemic, changes in technology that have accelerated, and the other changes that Steve outlined at the beginning of today's presentation. And we're going to need to be thinking about ways that we can support entrepreneurs as we move forward, not only as they think about starting businesses, but also as they work to sustain their business and to grow them.
Great. All right. So now we're going to open it up to questions. So we have one already. So are there any policies that specifically accelerated small businesses or direct sellers? I don't know who wants to take that.
Well, I'll start with, I don't know, I'll call policy. I think actually the condition, this comes back to something that Steve talked about. The nature of starting up a business, particularly that's supporting all this remote activity, is different than the constraints that somebody starting up a business in a traditional bricks and mortar environment. And I think one of the things that's that occurred in this pandemic that we couldn't have done this 15 years ago, and that's because widespread broadband access has been a tremendous supporter of all this, right? So that's partly why we can do what we're doing right now, and how we're organizing ourselves. And I think that's actually helped young businesses quite a bit. An interesting question, of course, is whether in areas where there is less widespread broadband access, whether that's been an adverse effect. We'll look at that.
Let me just speak to that a bit. I have a recent study with Jose Maria Barrero and Nick Bloom that looks at the impact of high quality internet access on the productivity of people when they work remotely. And not surprisingly, there's a pretty strong relationship there, but we try to put some numbers around that. And what we find is that, just as Sean said, given how much we had in the way of government mandated restrictions on work activity and voluntary responses to fears about the pandemic, things would have been a lot worse if we had not had broadband internet in place. On the other side of the coin, they could have also been better. We could have had a smaller recession with more productive workers if everybody in the economy had access in their homes to high-speed internet access. There's a very strong relationship in the micro data. Those for whom they have low quality or intermittent access to the internet, not surprisingly, don't find it very productive to work from home. Another thing, by the way, to speak to Jessica's point, that was a productivity killer at home was having lots of young children around and little space in which to work in a separate room. So that's also important, but that's a different policy issue.
Yeah, I definitely, I'm a mom of three. Luckily, my kids are self-directed at their age, but yeah, I mean, it is definitely, there are a lot of distractions with small children around. And I think people didn't really appreciate the fact that, you know, schools are more than just for education. It's basically custodial care. And actually the broadband point's super interesting. I had done a little research for our last webinar with Susan Collins, Senator Collins, and the US actually wasn't even in the top 10 of broadband deployment in the world. Like Thailand was ahead of us, which is, you know, a little embarrassing. So hopefully the infrastructure bill will help fix that. So another question, is there a clear, you know, Great Resignation link here? Can we say that people are leaving their jobs to start new companies?
I think it is striking that I think it's important to go look at the really high frequency time series on the application. So there was a surge in applications in summer 2020, and then it fell off. And indeed, we thought initially, well, maybe this was sort of temporary, and indeed these were lots of opportunity entrepreneurs associated directly with the pandemic. But then there's really been a second surge and more persistent surge in 2021. The first half more than the second half, but actually the second half of 2021 has been much stronger than the second half of 2020. This is precisely the time when quits have taken off as well. So do we have the direct link yet? We will, by the way, we'll be able to figure this out. The direct link that actually shows that individuals who are quitting are not only potentially taking a wage and salary jobs, but are actually starting up new businesses. I'm actually confident that that's what we'll find. Do we have that hard evidence yet? No.
Let me just take a slightly different tack on this. And it's not to disagree with anything John just said, but we do want to remember most people don't become entrepreneurs. Much as we like to talk about them, most people don't. So I think most of the surge in quits won't be a direct consequence of people quitting to form their own business. It will be, however, be a related phenomenon. They're looking for working arrangements that are more suitable to how they want to live their lives and what kind of professional activities they want to pursue. So I like to think of the Great Resignation as more of the Great Reshuffling. People are moving, in some cases, from wage and salary jobs to entrepreneur self-employment positions. But in other cases, they're moving from employers who don't offer the kind of flexibility with respect to working arrangements that they seek to employers who are. And often that the flexibility that people are interested in now is the ability to work from home part of the week. That was a very rare thing before the pandemic. So you couldn't really credibly tell your bank or other company you're working for, look, you got to let me work from home 2 days a week or I'm going to go work for your competitor. Now you can credibly say that. And many people are in fact walking with their feet. I think we see that again in work that I've done with Jose and Nick, where we ask people directly about their willingness to quit and why. And the desire for more flexibility in working arrangements scores very highly on both their willingness to quit, if they're forced to go back to the office 5 days a week, and you know what kind of job they plan to seek.
Well, let me mention another connection that's related to what Steve just said is in an economy where actually the job-to-job flow rate, the quit rate is high, is often it's a very dynamic and flexible economy. The last time we really had the kind of rates we're talking about now, we're in the late 1990s, which was also a time, by the way, of incredible surge in entrepreneurship. So one thing that's true about all these new businesses, many of them are going to fail. But particularly in an environment where it's more dynamic and flexible, the folks who fail can land on their feet. And that may be that they're not going to start up a new business. They're going to be able to find a wage and salary job, because indeed, this is a time where hiring is so robust.
Great. All right, we've got one last question here. Does the industry breakdown of new BFS data tell a story of potential survival rates of new startups going forward?
I don't, the survival rates of new businesses is incredibly low, right? So we should expect to see a very high failure rates. I don't think we know whether the survival rates will look different. Do I expect them to be especially high? The answer is no. I don't actually think that there's lots of experimentation that's going on right now. I think that's a healthy thing. It's part of what Steve was talking about. There's lots of uncertainty about the way the new normal is going to look, exactly where we're going to be doing what we're doing and how we're going to be doing it. And I think entrepreneurs are playing a role there. And again, I think that what we'll see is a relatively small fraction of these new businesses will be quite important, and we'll look back and say, oh yeah, they helped us change the way we're doing things.
Great. I believe Daniel Pink has a new book out where I think it's like 16,000 interviews. And one of the top finds was that the thing that people regretted the most was not starting a new business or going off on their own. And obviously that's, entrepreneurship is, one of the hallmarks of, America, going back to basically Benjamin Franklin, or maybe before that. And, I was actually thinking to myself, like, the word entrepreneur is a French word, but you don't really associate really entrepreneurship with France that much anymore. It's really the United States, hopefully, and not China. But anyway, on that note, we want to thank everybody for coming. And any remaining questions, we will follow up with you on email. And I just want to thank Jessica, John, and Steve for joining us. And happy Valentine's Day, everybody. Take care. Bye bye.
Happy Valentine's Day. Thanks.